Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yeah.
Amen.
All right. So as you can see, we've made some progress on Ki Tetze. We're actually at the Shvi'i Aliyah. And again, so much of Ki Tetze is about laws involving social justice. Social justice. So we're going to be looking at that right now. And it's interesting, how early on we have these basic principles of how you apply justice across the board. And you don't allow the fact that obviously society divides into classes, and how the temptation is for one class to take advantage, for upper classes to take advantage of lower classes. And the Torah is dead set against that kind of idea. And I think it possibly is also an application of the idea that we're all created in the divine image. So, lo ta'ashok sachir ani ve'evyon. You shall not wrong. And in this case, ashek is to hold what is due in wages. That's what they're thinking of here. So, sachir is a hireling, someone you've hired, especially one who is poor and destitute, as opposed to just a hireling period. And Rashi's going to comment on that because this is not the first time the Torah has raised that particular issue. Me'achecha, from your brother, or migercha, or from the stranger. And we know that the word ger in rabbinic usage regarding the Torah refers to someone who is not a born Israelite, someone who is living now amongst Israelites. Excuse me 1 second. Okay, so Asher Ba'artzecha, who is in your land, Bisha'arecha, and in your gates. So there's obviously some repetition here, and Rashi again is going to help us understand how the rabbis understand this apparent redundancy. So let's take a look. Lo tashok sachir. Excuse me 1 second. Sorry, I had to sneeze. So, anyway, lo tashok sachir. What exactly do we mean when we say you shall not withhold the wages of a hireling? V'halo kvar katuv. He says it's been written already. I mean, the Torah doesn't need to repeat itself. We already know this law. Ella, however, get however, la'avor al ha'evyon, right? To that we're talking now that if one does such a thing, we're now talking about transgressing against someone who is in a state of poverty. Vishnei lavim, that if you're to withhold the wages of someone who is actually poor, then you're now transgressing two negative commandments. Again, 1 second. Right. Lo ta'ashok schar sachir. So again, we already had elsewhere that one should not withhold the wages of someone who is a hireling. Shehu ani ve'evyon. Right. So now one should not withhold those wages of someone who is poor and destitute. Al Ha'ashir, so this is where he's referring to it right now, in this particular context in Deuteronomy. Al Ha'ashir Kfar Huzhar. But regarding someone who is in good shape, someone who's wealthy, right? Doesn't mean it's okay to withhold the wages of someone who's wealthy. But Kvar Huzhar, we have been already warned against that back in Leviticus chapter 19, right? That's in what is referred to as the holiness code. So there already it mentions that element of social legislation. And here it's talking specifically about someone who's poor. Lo ta'ashok et re'echa. So there, right, he says, where it says, the wording in Leviticus is, you shall not wrong your neighbor. So re'echa there is understood to refer to someone who's of means. So we have this idea of wronging by withholding wages. Evyon. So Rashi explains this word Evyon because we have again, Ani is someone who's poor. Evyon is someone who's even poorer than someone who could be considered poor. So we've translated it as destitute. And in Vayikra Rabbah, in the Midrash Vayikra Rabbah, they derive that word for hata'ev. So evyon is from this a play on words. Ta'ava is to lust, to desire l'chol davar. He desires everything. He is so poor, he doesn't have anything, and all he can do is desire it. Migercha, so again, from the stranger amongst you, ze ger tzedek. So he says the gercha, your ger, refers to what is called a ger tzedek. This is someone who's not a born Israelite, who takes on all the mitzvot, who converts entirely to Judaism. Bisha'arecha, in your gate. So what's that redundancy? Ze ger toshav. That's referring to a ger. What is this classification? Is a ger toshav. In other words, it's someone who isn't born an Israelite, but who lives amongst Israelites. Ha'ochel neveilot. And the only sense in which he does not take on all the mitzvot is that he still eats non-kosher meat. That's ochel neveilot, meaning meat that was not shechted. Asher ba'artzecha, and again these redundancies, right? Asher ba'artzecha, who is in your land. L'rabot, so that is to include, in your land is to include schar behema, that is to say the rental price of cattle, v'chelim, and vessels. So not only should you pay the rental, the hire of a human being, but also this includes now is something that is not a human being. In other words, an animal, which of course they used so often for draft purposes, right? The tractor of the ancient times, the chelim, and now it includes anything that is not actually living. Kelim meaning so it does. If you rent something, if you rent property, you should, in some sense, any kind of property, and there's a rental price, you should not withhold that. You need to pay, take care of it. Again, interesting ideas here. Beyomo, in his day, titen scharo, you should give his hire. So, in other words, the idea of not only making sure that you don't withhold wages, but that you pay wages on time. That if you hire somebody on a daily basis, they get paid by the day. Whatever agreement you've made with them by which they are to be compensated, they need to be compensated on time. So it's not just a question of the compensation itself, it's also the way in which it's paid promptly, right? And going on. So again, we're talking, remember, in the context of someone who is of less social standing, or someone who, in fact, really depends on the money. And that's the point about this, right? Is they're working because they're using that in order to survive. And so when you hold up paying for it, you are causing them to suffer. So, Beyomo titen scharo, in its day or at its proper time, you shall give his hire. V'lo tavo alav. Let's keep going. Hashemish, in other words, the sun should not set on him. Ki anihu, for he is poor. Ve'elav hu noseh et nafsho, and he places himself in danger for such things, to do this work. Rashi will explain exactly how. So to it, elav here means to the work that you're asking him to do. Literally, it means he carries his soul, right? He bears himself. Velo yikra alecha el Hashem, and he should not call out against you to God, v'haya b'chachet, so that you incur guilt. In other words, he's suffering so much and he feels so desperate, he's calling out to God for help because he hasn't been paid his salary. Okay, so let's go on here. Here we are. Ve'elav hu noseh et nafsho, and to it he bears himself, his soul. El haschar hazeh, in other words, for the sake of this, for his payment, right? Hu noseh et nafsho, he puts himself in danger, lamut Allah, lamut, comma, right? In other words, even to the point of death, he places his life in danger. Allah Bakevesh, he went up on a ladder, and we know how dangerous that can be, right? Venatla Ba'ilan, and he suspended himself, or Nitle Ba'ilan, he suspended himself from a tree. So the idea that people do, think about construction workers, etc., that they actually are doing dangerous work. Bahaya b'chachet, so that you will incur guilt, right? Mikomakom, right? So he says, of course, regardless, of course you'd incur guilt, even if he doesn't call out, right? You will incur guilt if you don't follow this particular mitzvah, which is to make sure he gets paid and paid promptly. Ella, however, shemimaharim li parea al yedei hakoreh. But what happens is that punishment will be extracted more quickly, more rapidly, al yedei hakoreh, because he has gone to a point of having to call out to God to help him. So again, it's interesting. As you know, I think that the subtext of the written Torah is doing what doesn't come naturally, and sadly, what it's talking about here are things that happen on a daily basis, where people aren't paid on time or aren't paid, and how important it really is that this is very, very important. Otherwise, the Torah wouldn't bother mentioning it. So. Lo yimtu avot al banim. Fathers should not be put to death on account of sons. Uvano lo yimtu al avot, nor should sons be put to death for their fathers. Ish bechet o yumatu. Every person should be, literally here it means put to death for his sin. In other words, we don't hold responsible someone else or take revenge in this particular kind of way or punish in this kind of way. And again, we are talking about the kinds of things that people unfortunately do and do in fact practice. So let's take a look here. Lo yumtu avot avanim, right? Fathers should not be put to death for sons. And Rashi explains, be'edut banim. So he says we should not take this literally, but we need to interpret it. So it says, in a sense, right? We have this principle that you are not asked to give testimony against your family, right? So the imtomar, but should you argue, avon banim, that we're talking about for the sins of their sons, which is the way we interpreted it to begin with. So this is one of those cases where the rabbis, through Rashi, of course, taking rabbinic material and explaining it to us, shows that how the rabbis understand the Torah, and not to take, that we would misunderstand the message if in fact we did not have their interpretation. So when it says they should not be put to death for their sons, here we're talking about literally at the testimony of their sons. We should not ask people to testify against their family, right? So he says, but if you would want to argue that, right, then in fact it does mean that they are being put to death for the sins of their sons. Kfar ne'emar. It's already stated elsewhere, ish becheto yumatu, right? Or yumtu, that a person should be put to death for their own sin. Aval mi, however, aval mi, she'eino ish. So he says something actually very interesting here, and in some ways it's disturbing, but it's something to consider. He says here, someone who is not a man. In other words, we're talking about minors. Met ba'avon aviv. They may in fact die on account of the sins of their fathers. So, as when someone is a minor, their father's behavior or their parents' behavior is significant in terms of their own health, right? V'haktanim, and just to make sure we understand, v'haktanim and minors meitin ba'avon avotam. They may in fact die through the iniquity or the sins of their fathers, bidei shamayim, meaning at the hands of heaven. So it's not suggesting for 1 second that human beings should act this way, but Rashi is and the rabbis are making a general observation of how important it is, the responsibility as parents that we have for our minor children, and how if we aren't careful, we can affect the lives of our children in such a profound kind of way that is the way of the world. But the fact, of course, they are minors. Once a person has attained majority, they, in fact, are now responsible. And remember, there's a bracha that one says, that a father says to his son at a bar mitzvah, right? Baruch shepatarani, blessed the one who has absolved me al shecheto shel zeh, for the sins of this one. So there it operates in the opposite way. Yes? Did you want to say something?
No, it's a remarkable comment
Yeah.
to hear at a bar mitzvah. I will have to listen up for that.
Yeah, well, it's not practiced that often, but that is in fact a tradition, right? In
Mhm.
other words, the fact is, and Rashi's talking about the other way around, where he says minors may be held accountable for
Right.
the sins of their parents, and at the bar mitzvah, it works the other way around too. In other words, if a minor commits sins because they're under under the control of their parent, the parent becomes responsible. So
Mhm.
just the opposite idea. Lo tate bishpat ger yatom. You should not subvert the judgment, the justice, right, of a non-Israelite yatom, an orphan. Continuing. So really, again, velo tachvol beged almana, and you shall not take as pledge the garment of a widow. Again, notice how we're talking about classes, and as I mentioned at the introduction of this, how sometimes upper classes or more powerful classes take advantage of those who are less positioned. And again, this is exactly this kind of idea here, right? That you should not subvert justice due to a non-Israelite. A yatom, of course, is an orphan. So we could, of course, put them together. In other words, an orphan who's a non-Israelite. But clearly, we are talking in general of someone. And what's again remarkable is that justice is justice, and it applies across the board, and isn't just justice for Israelites. I'm not going to say that there aren't certain laws that seem to be not applied across the board. But at least in this particular case, if we're talking about judgment regarding an infraction or loans or things like that, it has to be fair. So again, the fact that the Torah is pointing out someone who's of a lower class, Rashi's going to pick that up. The rabbis pick this up. But al ha'ashir kfar huzar. The point is, justice has to apply to the wealthy as well. So he says, regarding someone who's wealthy, who's of means, kfar huzar. We've already been given that warning in Deuteronomy chapter 16. It says, Lo tate mishpat. So there it says there that you should not subvert justice. So here we are. Why repeat it? So he says, Vishana ba'ani, and he repeats it regarding someone who is poor, la'avor alav bishnei lavim. Again, what it does is it says you're even more liable for having subverted justice against someone who's poor. So literally, he's saying that you've now transgressed two negative commandments, right? Mishnei Lavim. Why? And so, why should there be an added level of punishment, an infraction here? And he says, lefi, because shinakel, because it's very easy lehatot mishpat ani. It's a lot easier to subvert the judgment of a poor person, yoter mishel asher, more than someone who is wealthy. Lechach, he's here, v'shana alav. And for this reason, the Torah warns and goes a second time and repeats the warning regarding someone who is poor. Lo tachbol, in other words, take in pledge. Shelo b'sha'at halva'ah. He says, but the point here is not as a general rule, but saying that if it's not at the time of the loan itself. So, in other words, you shouldn't take as a pledge at the time when the loan is not being made, right? That you should. So that's certainly what it's sounding here. That if in fact a pledge has to be, security has to be for the loan, that's one thing, right? But it's in some ways, it doesn't, it sounds like just the opposite. Me, do you have any explanation in your particular text there, if you have them open?
No, the translations are pretty close. I have an interlinear Rashi, and then I have the art scroll.
But it doesn't explain, what exactly Rashi means here, you know.
Not to any greater degree, no.
Yeah. So perhaps it's possibly, we do have all of this here, which is the Torah Tamima, and he certainly goes into far greater detail regarding to what the codes, or rather what the rabbinic material has to say about this. So
Right.
I am going to I had a thought about this. Um, as to what he means that you shouldn't take his pledge when it isn't an actual loan, or it's possible that you're lending something to this person, for a certain period of time, say from on a daily basis, because there's another law elsewhere which talks about taking it back so that they can sleep in it or whatever. So
Yeah.
it could be referring to that particular idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're basically citing Bava Metzia
Yeah.
uh, on my translation. That's all.
Yes. Yes. Okay. I'm looking to see if there's yeah, I'm looking to see. So Beget Almanaz here. Here is the Torah Tamima. Let me see if there's nope, nope, he doesn't have a lot to say about this here, interestingly. Okay. He may say it more in his commentary, right? Here he simply says whether she's poor, or whether she's wealthy. So exactly
Right.
the implication here, we'll have to take a look and see what we're talking about here. All right, going on. So here now we have a rationale. V'zacharta, and you shall remember, ki eved hayita b'mitzrayim, that you were slaves in Egypt. Don't forget what side of the tracks you came from, right? Vayiftecha Hashem Elokecha misham, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Al kain, and for this reason, anunchi mitzavcha lashot, I am commanding you to practice this, et hadavar hazeh, this particular matter. In other words, the fact that the Jewish people, when they were slaves in the land of Egypt, of course, as slaves, they were impoverished, right? They were a slave is of the lowest class in a society, and yet God had mercy on them and redeemed them. And consequently, we need to have as ourselves to never forget that particular event, and also make sure that we don't treat people that are underclassed unfairly. Going on, v'zacharta, you shall remember. So what's the purpose? Amanat kain pediticha. It was for this very reason that I redeemed you, lishmor chukotai, to guard my commands or my statutes, Afilu yesh chesron kis badavar. Even if you have to suffer a loss, pecuniary loss, a loss of money in following these commandments, you still have to do it. And to keep that in mind, that God rescued us from Egypt for a purpose, not simply for no reason whatsoever. And to have that sense of appreciation in performing these commandments. Going on. Ki tiktsor kitsircha basadeh, when you reap your harvest in the field, v'shachachta omer, and you forget an omer, that's a measure of grain, basadeh, in the field, when you're in the process of harvesting the field and you forget a sheaf of grain, an omer in the field, lo tashuv lekachto, you shall not return to go and pick it up. Lager laetom v'lamana yeh. It shall be for the non-Israelite, the orphan, and the widow. Again, social justice. Leman, for so that Yivarechacha Hashem Elohecha, the Lord your God will bless you, b'chol ma'aseh in all the work of your hands. So again, this is made famous by the story of Ruth, because she went to glean, but the whole idea that we don't own everything, and that in fact we don't own anything, and that we have to remember that God is the ultimate owner of these things, and this is part of the rules of the loan that we have, right? So let's take a look at the Rashi here. So, vatishkach v'shachachta omer, you forget an omer. So the fact that the Torah specifies an omer, velo gadish, and it's not a pile of grain, right? So we're talking about a sheaf or so, but not the entire pile of grain. Mikan amru, and from this, the fact that it mentions omer, they said omer sheyoshbo satayim, if the omer, and I think here they're talking about a sheaf of wheat, right, or grain, sheyoshbo satayim, that has in fact two se'az. That's again another measure, which would be larger than an omer, v'shachacho, and if he forgot it, eino shicha. The actual term of this law, of this application, is shikha, which means forgetting. So the law is a law of forgetting and the fact that you can't go back. But on the other hand, there are in fact the application of that law, and the Torah isn't saying whatever you forgot. But the fact that the Torah mentions specifically an omer means that if it's larger than an omer and you forgot, you can go back and pick it up. Basadeh, in the field. Lerabot shichat kama. So the fact that it says it's in the field, lerabot means to include. Shichat kama, that is, if you forget standing grain, and I believe standing grain means that it's still in the field, it's still growing, right? Sheshachach mitzata miliktzor, which he forgot a little bit of it from reaping it. So kama is grain that is still standing and is attached to the ground, and the fact that it says in the field, basadeh. Again, where would this grain be? So we're looking at this apparent redundancy to say that it's actually there to add something to the law and our understanding of this law. Lo tashuv lakachto, you shall not return to go get it, pick it up, right? This is the tractate Pe'ah, which means the corner, because there's another law regarding the corner of a field. And this is chapter 6, Mishnah Daled, Mishnah 4. And that's because the tractate Pe'ah, there's no Babylonian Talmud to tractate Pe'ah. There is the Talmud Yerushalmi for it, but here we're referring here to the Mishnah itself. Mikan, and from here, Amru, they said, Shila Acharav, right? It says, you shall not return. So it Shicha, that the idea of having forgotten grain is, and this law that you can't go back and get it, only refers to if the fact that the grain is behind you, that in the process of reaping the field, you have forgotten it behind you. Shelifanav, however, if the grain is in front of you, right, still in front of you, eino shicha, it is not considered shikha, she'eino beval tamshuv, because you can't say, you shall not return. So remember, it's a wide field. It's a wide field, and again, you're not necessarily encompassing the entire width of the field as you're moving through the field to pick up the grain. But if it's part that of the field that still needs to be harvested, that is not considered shikha. And with this, let's see, I think that's it for the Rashi on this. Nope, let's do a little more. Leman yivarechacha, in order that he should bless you. And this is from the Sifrei, Midrash, right, on Numbers and Deuteronomy. The afalpi sheba'et shebata liyado, right? That even though this mitzvah came to for you to practice shelo mi bemit kaven. In other words, the fact that you forgot it meant you weren't thinking about it, right? This mitzvah, kal vachomer. How much the more so? In other words, the fact that God will bless you for the fact that you forgot this, right? That it wasn't in your mind. If it were, you wouldn't have forgotten it, right? So, kal vachomer, how much the more so, leoseh b'mitkavein, to what you do with intention. Emor me'ata, right? So you can say from now, Nafla sela miado, if a a coin, right, of some value, fell miado, umatza ani, and if a poor person found that coin that you dropped, even though you dropped it by mistake, right? But a poor person found it, v'nit parnespa, and he now was able to sustain himself through that coin, hare hu mitbarech aleha, you will be blessed regarding this coin. In other words, you didn't even know you dropped this coin, but a poor person picked it up and was able to benefit from this. You still are blessed for these things. That's a very like it's a very beautiful and thoughtful issue going on here, saying it isn't only just for mitzvahs that we do b'kavanah with full intent and purpose, but even mitzvahs that happen when you don't even realize what happened, there's still a source of blessing for you. And that's where we will end for today. And if you want to make any comments for the record, please feel free. All right, we'll pop up.
Very good.
So let's gonna mark it here, and I'll stop the, let's see here, and I'll stop the share.
I have a comment.
Yes, go ahead, Harlan.
Um, when you have the tribes and a woman and one wants to marry a man, they should marry in their own tribe. They can't cross tribes. Okay. Now on this one here, the Lord, I don't know. I'm not against it. It's like the red heifer. I don't understand that. But the Lord said that if you see a woman that you like after when you're fighting and you win and you like this woman, you could marry her. Well, this woman is not Jewish. I don't understand that. What he's saying. They say you take the woman and you cut her nails and take her captured a uniform off and all this stuff. In other words, a soldier could take a woman, captured woman, and marry her. It's not when you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to marry within the tribe, within the
Okay.
Jewish.
So let me
I don't
let me
understand that.
right. Okay. So of course you're referring to the very beginning of this parsha. You're not referring to anything that we did today.
No, I'm not referring to that.
Okay,
That's what I
and
want to
that's
know. I
okay.
want to know
That's okay.
why.
Okay. So Harlan, first of all, a woman is not allowed to marry a man from another tribe only if her father has no sons. Because they were talking about the property. The situation was that if a man has no sons and only daughters, then the daughters inherit his property. Okay? If he has a son, the son inherits the property. So if the daughter inherits the property and then goes and marries someone from another tribe, the property that she has would become the property of another tribe. That was the
Oh,
concern there. Okay. So it's strictly a case where a man leaves no male heirs whatsoever. Then a woman has to marry within her tribe. Okay. So that's one thing. The second thing is that even though we don't necessarily talk about formal processes of conversion, the situation that you're talking about is a case of a captive woman, a woman who's captured in battle. And part of the problem is, and this is, it's interesting. I think Rashi makes the point, and he's quoting the rabbis, Dibra Torah keneged Yetzer Hara, that the Torah is trying to take into account uh, the darker side of human behavior. And the answer is
Yep.
that very often, and I mentioned this, by the way, in the earlier sections that we did when we actually were studying this law together, that in battle, right, back then, in order not to be killed, there were women who would purposely dress up, doll themselves up, and in fact, of course, seduce the soldiers, and that way they would not be killed. All right? So we're talking about a situation where this man was seduced by, or unfortunately raped a woman. Okay? And we're not in any way in favor of this kind of behavior. That's the point that Rashi's making at the beginning, that the Torah here is trying to talk strictly in a case of this particular circumstance, because under battle, when you're actually under fire and actually in a situation where you clearly could be killed at any moment, right? That your behavior is going to be affected in that way. So the whole point here is this man has had relations with this woman, right? She's not Jewish, she's from this other people. And instead of just leaving her there, he is to take her into his home, okay? And he's to allow her to mourn for her parents for 30 days. And the idea here is that it's not that we want him to marry her necessarily, but he needs to be able to see who she really is and not just marry her for her looks. Okay. And if he chooses not to, and after 30 days, if he wants to marry her, he can marry her. But the whole point, I mean, this is a long and complex law, that if he chooses not to marry her, he is not allowed to sell her as a slave,
oh,
right? Because
right.
he's
And
had his way
the
with her.
purpose of the paring of the nails and the cutting of the hair is
Yeah,
to make her unattractive to
correct,
him, so
correct.
he will not want to keep
Right,
her on permanently.
right, right. We don't want to encourage this behavior under any circumstances. But on the other hand, we also want to treat someone fairly. She's a human being. And the truth is, to this very day, we see human beings treating other human beings as if they're nothing more than chattel. Even though she's not an Israelite, she didn't come from an Israelite beginning, and perhaps her behavior wasn't the best in the world, okay, he has no right to treat her and sell her as a slave. That's the very end of this whole little section that deals with that particular law. So there are a bunch of issues that are actually involved there. So I hope that helps, Harlan. I hope that helps you understand what's going on there. But it is complicated. So with this, I'm going to stop the recording, and thank you.